Welcome to Turning Hard Times to Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm speaking to you from New York City on the third day of November 2020. I will have a brief comment or two to make about the presidential election in a few minutes from now. But now I want to thank all of you for listening to this show and making it one of the more popular shows in the Voice America Business Channel. Also want to thank our sponsors for making this show economically possible. Benchmark Metals, NV Gold, Hannon Metals, Irving Resources, Novo Resources, Sitka Gold Corp, Lion One Metals, Grand Portage, GMV Minerals, and SK Mining Corp are the sponsors for this week's show. Regarding our sponsors, GMV Minerals published an updated economic study on its Mexican Hat project in Arizona. At the current gold price of $1,900, the Mexican Hat project returns a pre-tax internal rate of return of 58.3% or 44.3% after tax, and a net present value of 5% discounted one of $265.1 million. That's after a tax NPV of $182 million, with a payback in 2.1 years for a 10-year mine life. Now, it should be noted that the company has considerable potential to enlarge this deposit, and with that, enhance the economics still further. But suffice it to say that compared to a 5% discounted after-tax present value of $182, the company's current share price, which gives it a market cap of a mere $15 million in Canadian money or $12 million in U.S. money, suggests the stock is hugely undervalued. And I do expect to talk more about GMV in my weekly newsletter that will be going out on Saturday. For the sake of disclosure, I should mention that I have purchased shares of GMV, as is the case with all the companies that are sponsors to this show, and all of them are also covered in my newsletter first before they become sponsors. I do like to vet the companies before they're sponsors. I vet them for my subscribers and for my own portfolio as well before you hear about them. I also want to mention another company that I think deserves a great deal of attention, and that is New Legacy Gold, NRG in Toronto, NULGF in the U.S. New Legacy is not currently a sponsor to this show, but it is a company I cover in my newsletter and one I own personally. Dr. Quinton Henning, who is a technical advisor to New Legacy, suggested that investors should be watching this story as the drilling on the company's Red Hill project that's located just south of several 10 million ounce gold deposits along the Battle Mountain Trend is progressing very rapidly. That is, the drilling is coming along very rapidly, and Quinton thinks people should keep their eyes on this story. Now, to understand why Dr. Henning and his team at New Legacy are so excited about the exploration project, you can view a Zoom interview that I did with Quinton by going to the video page at Jay Taylor Media or watch it on my YouTube channel, Jay Taylor Media. Speaking of Dr. Henning, he will be with me during the second segment of today's show to provide an update on Novo Resources as that company progresses towards production during the first quarter. He suggests during the early part of the first quarter of 2021. Before I talk more about today's show, let me just pass along my thoughts about the election today in the United States. I don't need to tell you that this election is considered by many, if not most Americans, leaning either towards Democrats or towards the Republican side, to be the most consequential election since the Civil War. On the other hand, John Rubino, who was a great guest, who was a recent guest on this show on October 20th, suggested that it is the least important election of our lifetime. That seemed like a pretty controversial statement, so John was on the show to talk about it. And from an economic point of view, I tend to agree with John in the sense that whoever wins the presidency and controls the U.S. government will be faced with the worst economic scenario since the Great Depression. Now, I know Donald Trump isn't telling you that. That's what I believe. No matter who's in the White House, they're going to be facing some huge economic headwinds. So whoever wins the White House is likely to be blamed, I think, for the suffering that lies ahead. And we Americans, and indeed the entire Western world, are now facing enormously difficult economic times thanks to, I believe, thanks very largely to the detachment of gold from money. Without the discipline of gold and by abusing the great military power of America post-World War II, both major political parties in the U.S. took advantage of our place in the world to force other countries to use the dollar for international exchange. For many decades, we were able to live beyond our means as the United States, here in the United States, thanks to the willingness of foreigners to relend those dollars that they earned from our constant trade deficits, to relend them back to the U.S. Treasury. Those days are now seemingly coming to an end, and we in the United States are now going to have to face an economic downturn, I believe, the likes of which we have not witnessed in the U.S. since the 1930s. The question that the election today will at least partly answer is how we will, as a nation, deal with a level of hardships that very few, if any, Americans alive today have experienced. Regarding the ability to bounce back economically, Ron Paul used to say, quote, "If we are free, we will become prosperous as a nation. But if the government takes that freedom away from us, we will become enslaved and impoverished," end of quote. Well, our founding fathers gave us a constitution with checks and balances designed to keep us free from the heavy hand of government that limited the ability of the masses to be free and prosperous according to their God-given abilities. There were many institutions that were put in place by our founders to keep government from becoming a tyrannical abuser of its citizens. And I will mention just a couple of them that the progressive wing of the Democrat Party now want to remove. The Electoral College, for example, which, if eliminated, would mean that all the red states in America now will become enslaved because they will no longer have any representation in the executive branch of our government. The packing of the Supreme Court is another institution that the progressives apparently want to do away with. If that were to happen, what it essentially would do by packing the Supreme Court with left-wing justices, it would essentially remove the Supreme Court as a check and balance, a check against the power of the executive and of the legislative branches of government. So, by removing the executive from having any concerns for people living in less populated states, and by eliminating the Supreme Court, progressives will have eliminated the checks and balances, most of them that are remaining. Under this scenario, in theory, the progressives, if they were to have a 51% majority, and they wish to have the 49% of the population put to death, there would be nothing standing in the way of that. Such is the way of totalitarian governments, and we have had several examples of communist and fascist governments over the past 100 years or so that have done that sort of thing. An important event paving the way for totalitarian government is the removal of the freedom to worship God, because for totalitarian governments, the state has to replace God as the solution to humankind's problems. And tyrants thrive. Really, they do. They thrive on people being dependent on them. So if people are dependent on God and their own skills and talents to go it alone, then government becomes less necessary, hence the need to keep people enslaved by those that want to rule over them. So in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, it was noted that our freedoms come from God, not from man. Those were the concerns of our founding fathers, which is why they put in place all the checks and balances that now frustrate the desire of progressives to grab dictatorial power to rule over America, to end Americans that they don't like. The deplorables, I guess they were called once. So while I agree with John Rubino that in terms of the future of the U.S. economy, the outcome of the election today may not be all that important, in terms of the structure of our government, the removal of the remaining checks and balances, and with that, a move towards a yet-to-be-defined American dictatorship is extremely important. Certainly, the ability of this radio program and many other conservatives to continue to speak freely will likely depend on which side wins the November 3rd election, the election that's being held today, especially if the Senate and the House were to both change parties. Now, I should note that this program's First Amendment rights have already been violated by YouTube when they removed an interview I did a few weeks back with James Perloff. A continued move to the left is most certain to remove what remains of our First Amendment rights as Americans. Unthinkable to me as a 73-year-old who always believed that the First Amendment was by far the most important ingredient and amendment to the Constitution. Well, as for today's show, I've titled it Preparing for a Monetary Reset. Alistair MacLeod and Dr. Quinton Henning return as my guests today. As noted, in just a few minutes from now, Dr. Henning will join me to provide an update on Novo Resources. That's a company that is moving very rapidly towards production at its Beaton's Creek project in Western Australia. And in the second half of today's show, Alistair MacLeod joins me to discuss why a monetary reset of some kind is all but inevitable. Now, he has warned about the demise of the dollar some months ago on this show. More recently, he has talked about the inevitability of an end of the euro and the end of his own currency, the British pound. I want to ask Alistair why the destruction of the current fiat system is inevitable and what he thinks will replace the current global monetary system. We are going to take a commercial break now, but don't go away, because when we come back, Dr. Quinton Henning will be with me to talk about Novo Resources as it moves towards Beaton's Creek production and a lot of other really exciting things going on with that company as they expand their production to the West in a lot of different ways. Dr. Henning will explain right after we come back.